Thanks for having me. I was here not here, but at this event last year, and really enjoyed being here, and hope to have a really good conversation today. If at any point you have questions, just shout them out or shoot your hand up. I don't particularly like to be the lecturer of presentation style, so just ask questions away, and if there's something that I need to dig a little deeper into or drill down on, please don't hesitate. So as Bill mentioned, what I really want to talk about is the stuff that's going to matter to you in terms of how we develop the year for infrastructure financing. We have essentially rewritten, thrown away, burnt the old playbook for moving legislation, for dealing with politics. And I don't think anybody really knows how the next 4 years are going to unfold. We've certainly seen a significant change in the landscape in Washington and how operations get done. We've certainly seen on the news all of the fallback and the reaction to a lot of those actions taken so far. But at some point, the rubber is going to meet the road, and there's going to need to be some serious conversations about what legislation, what executive actions, what judicial review needs to look like over the next several years. So I want to talk about that from a strictly financial perspective, as legislation has passed recently that will impact the project size and the project financing of your customers and your businesses. So I want to start with that, and then I want to transition into a little bit of a discussion about where we can expect the Congress and the President's interactions to move within the first 100 days, within the first year, within the first 2 years, because before you know it, we're going to start talking about the Democratic candidate to run against Donald Trump, probably no less than 2 years from now. So that doesn't give a very big window for any sort of real legislation or real action to take place that isn't going to be hyper-partisan, if you can imagine it not being hyper-partisan right now. And that's an unfortunate necessity of our system. So let's get into it. I don't want to editorialize too much. So here's what we're looking at as far as dedicated water infrastructure spending. These appropriation line items have been funded through the end of April 2017. These 2016 numbers were just extended. That's why I don't have 2017 numbers at the moment. In December, Congress essentially punted on the appropriations process on the budget, as has become customary for them, and basically just said, we're going to continue where we're at now. So these are the numbers for the EPA, $2.25 billion for clean water and drinking water. That is actually the number for 2015 also. So clearly Congress has been really working hard on changing their budget structure. And then the RUS, Rural Utility Service, is $555 million. So those are the specific line items that come directly from the federal government. What we saw at the end of 2016 was a significant piece of legislation that actually moved in conjunction with the budget process, and that's the Water Infrastructure Improvements for the Nation, WIN. Washington loves these acronyms, and they don't actually mean anything. But it sounds catchy, and they need something to hang their hat on. So this, in addition to the reauthorizing the money that I just mentioned for appropriations, this adds some new funding line items. So it authorizes 30 Water Corps of Engineers water resources projects. Now, what I mean by water resources is it's a pretty broad definition of essentially hurricane stormwater prevention, dam and port rehabilitation, water, wastewater, and sewer water treatment and delivery. So those 30 projects are exclusively funded projects within the legislation. They're listed, they're vetted by the House and Senate committees, and they know exactly where the dollars are. They're design build projects that are already being implemented and constructed. I'll show you a map of where they are in just a minute so you can get a sense of where those projects and where some of your customers are going to be calling you from. The $300 million grant for small and disadvantaged communities facing water infrastructure emergencies, for water infrastructure standards, is essentially one of the two components that's a response to Flint, Michigan. As a result of the conversations that were had after the drinking water problems that we saw, the city of Flint and the state of Michigan, along with a number of the other Great Lakes region states, basically said you have us set to these water quality standards, but you don't give us any money to figure out how to actually do it. We can't raise our rates for political reasons or by statute in certain areas, and we can't maintain the level of quality that you require of us to avoid federal prosecution. So this $300 million is Congress's response to that. Is that going to cover all of it? Not even close, which is, again, pretty typical of Congress. The $300 million to reduce lead in drinking water is the other component, and those dollars will go specifically towards areas where lead pipes and lead drinking water chemistry, the lead in drinking water is elevated, and that will likely go directly towards replacing those pipes, rather than treating the water differently or cleaning out the pipes or using a different treatment process. They will specifically go towards new pipes in the ground, which, as representing the contracting world, is a great great thing. From the supply side, I imagine it's a good thing as well. But it is not exactly the most environmentally friendly, and it was a very difficult lift for Congress, especially on the Democrats who want the environmental protections that come with federal financing, but don't want to balance them with spending constraints. So the $100 million for grants with water infrastructure emergencies is a earmark without it actually being an earmark for the state of Michigan. All of those dollars will go directly towards the Flint, Michigan, Detroit area infrastructure financing. So all of these items are brand new. So these are all new spending items in addition to the appropriations process. There's a few more that I'm going to go over. Oh, went too far. These are where the Army Corps authorization projects are coming. Most of these are, if not breaking ground, will be sometime this spring. And there are 30 of them, so it's not like there's a shortage of these projects to move forward. This graph shows sort of the age and prevalence for using lead pipe as a material, predominantly in the Northeast and the Great Lakes region is where lead drinking water, lead pipes leading to lead in drinking water is most prevalent. So those areas will be most likely to see some of this residual $300 million in compliance. So the bill also has $385 billion for dam reconstruction and rehabilitation. This map shows the number of dams that are in significant need of those fundings. Now there's a lot more red than there is any other color, and as you can imagine, red is the most dire of situations. So at one point when I did this research, I remember, but I want to say there are something like 12,000 dams that are in need of drastic or immediate emergency repair. So $385 million is not going to go very far, especially when you stretch it over 10 years. I'm not really telling you anything you don't know. We have significant water infrastructure needs in this country, and we seem to have a Congress and a Congress that doesn't really want to look at it, which we'll get to in just a second. But gladly, we have an administration that seems to be emphasizing infrastructure, that seems to be interested in rebuilding, replacing, and spending money on infrastructure, which we all know is drastically needed. So this map is a little bit of a segue into what we're going to talk about as far as the need for water infrastructure. These states are the State Revolving Fund, Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, and Clean Water State Revolving Fund. I always mess that up. States where their percentage is higher. And what I mean by that is the EPA determines who they allocate the dollars for the SRFs based on the needs of those states. The EPA performs a study for what the investment cost for these projects will be every 4 years. And these states are the highest in each of their categories. Now the yellow states are at the top of both lists, the drinking water and clean water. The green states are at the top of the clean water needs list, and the blue are just the drinking water. So that's funny, as I was getting ready to speak, I was having a glass of water, which I was told almost before I took a sip that the water here is unfiltered. And now I guess that I see that, I maybe would have opted for a bottled water instead. But the optics of working for the construction side of building water infrastructure, it doesn't bode well with Dasani in my hand. So when we go forward, I would remember this map, because what we're talking about next at the WIFIA program, which is again a brand new program, these are the states where at least 50% of the dollars for infrastructure financing are going to go. It's not obviously not 50% of the states, but it does represent more than 50% of our population as a result of the metropolitan areas and whatnot. So that will be a political hurdle that we'll have to face when we move any sort of infrastructure legislation here soon. So all that being said, those are new opportunities for water infrastructure investment. So what are we looking at right now? The landscape, as you can imagine, has shifted significantly, both with Congress and with the administration, because the election of Donald Trump was, first of all, surprising to most, and second of all, has been off to a rocky start. I don't think it's too far to say that there have been some significant impingements and obstacles that the Trump administration has had to deal with that they would have rather not had to deal with, the General Flynn just being the most recent today. I'm not casting opinionizing on any of the right or wrongness of it, but I think we can all agree it's not off to the running start that we had all hoped, especially considering how robust his conversations were about investing in infrastructure and putting America back to work and building America back. Nevertheless, there are some line items that we know Congress is going to be working on, because for all the change that's happened at the executive branch, Congress is still largely the same. They're still largely, I know this might come as a shock, but they're still largely unproductive and very polarized. So getting to any sort of majority in either the House or the Senate is going to be more about conserving your party, for the Republicans anyway, than it is about moderating compromise between some of the Democrats. That isn't going to be the case every time, because there will inevitably be opportunities in the Senate where they will need to peel off Democratic support in order to get past either the 51 threshold for passing legislation or to be able to move legislation through the Senate, which requires 60 votes. I think if the confirmation hearings, excuse me, are any indication, we're going to be in for a very partisan divided remaining 2 years. But it's important to remember as we go into this that the landscape for the 2018 election is not very friendly to Democrats. 22, I believe, Democrats are in the Senate are up for re-election in Trump-winning states. So that is going to weigh heavily on their decisions and their optics for voting how they do in the Senate. And it will, quite frankly, shift a lot of the emphasis and the responsibility away from the Republicans in governing to early campaigning for a lot of these senators who are going to need to get elected by people that they've essentially spent the last 4 weeks admonishing. So that's something to keep in mind as we talk about these issues. Obviously, the Affordable Care Act is going to be at the top of everybody's list. Republicans have already said that they are going to repeal and replace. They've actually already repealed it through budget reconciliation, but they have no idea what to replace it with. There is a significant infighting within the House and Senate Republicans about what to do and what to replace it with, to the point that they can't even agree on whether to call it a replacement or a repair. And that is, this is the kind of stuff I deal with every day. One way or the other, whether you call it replace or repair, the Affordable Care Act is going to have to change because they've already pulled it out of the budget reconciliation. So that means whenever they start to do fiscal year 2018 this summer, they're going to have to find legislative language to redirect a lot of those funds. And where they go still remains to be seen. There is some significant components of the Affordable Care Act that we know are going to go, and there are going to be some significant components that we know are going to stay. The ones that obviously are going to go are the employer mandate, all of the 40-hour week requirements, all of the sections of business size and requirements to cover or to maintain coverage or to have coverage for your employees are going to go. But some components like the ceiling on lifetime healthcare costs are going to stay, removing the ceiling, having your 26-year-old children under their parents' health insurance is going to stay. So really navigating and threading the needle on what that's going to look like is going to be a challenge, and is probably not going to happen in public view. It's probably going to happen behind the scenes with no more than 10 members of the House and the Senate, and they're probably going to put out another bill that's 1,200 pages. And I say that not to discourage you from the political process, but because the bill that they wrote initially was 2,200 pages. I had the ominous distinction of having to read the Affordable Care Act when it was passed in 2009. I was still working in Congress at the time, and almost half of it was the kind of legislative and legalese that doesn't make any sense to anybody. It doesn't say what you're going to spend money on. It just says the code is going to be changed and amended this way or that way or replaced or whatever. I really hope none of you ever have to read a piece of legislation. But what they replace it with will have to come fairly quickly. The regulatory reform and elimination is something that we at NUCA are very pleased to hear and very pleased to be working on. Regulation has been drowning businesses across the country in paperwork and additional costs and in hampering movement for projects, for growth, for employee growth, for hiring. Any element of your business that isn't regulated probably is regulated, and you may want to contact your attorney if you're not looking at it. We look at easing of regulations as a way to have our businesses become more productive, not in a sense of at the expense of our employees or of safety or of anything. But we do see the need to make it easier for businesses to move forward with projects. We see that it's a necessity if we really want to continue to hire people into our or attract people into our workforce, and we really need a lot of these regulations to go. And the president's promise to eliminate 2 regulations for every one that is implemented is in concept a great idea until we talk about which regulations are going to be repealed. What we have advocated at NUCA is for a bill called the REINS Act, which means, it's again one of those acronyms, regulations from the executive in need of scrutiny. And essentially what it will do is require Congress to approve any regulation that comes over $100 million. So any regulation that costs nationwide businesses more than $100 million will have to be approved by Congress, not just the option to approve. Will have to be approved, or the regulation will be barred from going into effect. We mentioned a little bit the budget process, but the current budget landscape will end at the end of April. My birthday is April 27th, so I'm very fortunate to have a great birthday gift on the horizon. And by that I mean I will probably be drowning in appropriations work. Thank you very much. The tax reform issue that is the next bullet is actually interwoven into the federal budget, and that will bring us into the conversation about what an infrastructure plan will look like. In order for infrastructure as a plan to move forward, one of the biggest hurdles is going to be how they're going to pay for it. And I was having this conversation with some gentlemen right before this, that the word pay for in Washington is not the same context that we all think of paying for our groceries or our house or any of our regular expenses, because the federal government can do essentially whatever they want with their money. They don't have to balance their budget. They can print money if they really need it. So it's not exactly the same idea of paying for something in the sense that you have either a finite line of credit or you have a loan or a mortgage or actually cash in hand. But the politicians want you to think that it runs that way. So when they say pay for, what they really mean is they need to cut somewhere else. And what they're going to say is we have to fully fund and fully pay for whatever infrastructure bill we put forward. But I would argue that misses the mark entirely. As we all know, the investments that we make in federal infrastructure are going to have a significant return on investment. And it's not necessarily the case that $1 spent on infrastructure leads to $1 decrease to the Treasury as far as revenue is concerned. Because for every dollar in infrastructure infrastructure investment that we make, $3 is actually returned to the Treasury, which is a completely other financial conversation. But it misses the mark, and the lawmakers need to hear about that, because lawmakers don't understand that investing in infrastructure, as soon as the water pipes are operational and the water treatment facility is finished, the value of the land and the value to the business community around it is already better, is already more valuable, is already generating greater revenue for the federal government, which I think significantly outweighs the dollar that they actually put forward in the first place. So that is going to be part of our message moving forward. But in order to find those sort of dollars, in order to play the game, with Congress, we're going to have a discussion about tax reform. And what I mean by that is, in order to find the dollars that are going to be necessary to get to this benchmark that the president has put forward, which is invest $100 billion in infrastructure, you can't just write a check for that. I know I sort of contradicted myself. The federal government could write a check for that. Will they? No. They're going to have to ease regulations for the banking industry or something like that in order to find what they would call a static cost. Or they're going to have to change the way the business code is written for international tax. And what some of the ideas that have been moving forward include a repatriation tax, a changing of the international tax code, a clearing of sort of the decks as far as tax credits and tax loopholes. A number of tax-related issues are at stake here, including municipal bonds and tax-exempt bonds as a way to pay for this. Now, I don't know anyone in the infrastructure community that doesn't use municipal bonds or tax-exempt bonds to get their projects moved forward. So moving legislation that would change either one of those to pay for infrastructure is cutting off your nose in spite of your face. It just simply won't move legislation forward. But the tax reform will be the mechanism that they move with in April in order to find the financing. So that leads us into this infrastructure plan. We have no idea what this infrastructure plan is going to look like. The president has put together an advisory committee, which right now just consists of the Secretary of Transportation. So it's not exactly a very widely shared or wide membership. But their committee is essentially the face of what's going to be the business community's interaction with the administration on how this infrastructure plan is going to move forward. Like most executive branch advisory committees, it's going to be mostly for show. The president has already got his idea of what the plan is going to look like, what the structure of any infrastructure bill is going to look like, and the advisory committee is going to be basically the PR movement or the credibility agent for infrastructure plans. So what does that look like? Well, the question that we're currently facing is, how is infrastructure going to be defined? Now, about half of the time you hear anyone talk about infrastructure, water is almost entirely left out. So that is an opportunity for us to educate these members of Congress and the administration, because infrastructure doesn't just mean roads and bridges. If we look back to 2009 when we had the stimulus bill of $2 trillion, the money that went towards infrastructure basically went to repaving highways. And that doesn't take us anywhere. That doesn't do anything when laying another 2 inches of asphalt is going to have to get torn up because the pipes underneath burst because they're overworked and undermaintained. So we have advocated a more comprehensive definition of infrastructure, which includes water and wastewater. And it will be essential, and I can't understate this, it will be essential that water and wastewater and any water infrastructure alliance or interested party is at this table. Otherwise, the transportation and the bridges and the airports guys are going to get all of that money because they are the politically sexy infrastructure ideas. People are going to walk out their front door and they're going to see their paved road. They're not going to see how clean their water is. They'll taste it and they'll know it, and we'll be able to have hotels where you can actually drink the tap water. But that's just the reality. Out of sight is out of mind. And that is going to be a significant struggle for us moving this infrastructure plan and being involved in that. So including ourselves and including water and wastewater as a part of this infrastructure plan will be absolutely essential. Not to say anything about roads and bridges not being needed. There's certainly need there, but if you're going to tear up the roads and repave it, you may as well tear out the pipes underneath it and redo them at the same time, just to avoid costs and all. There's all sorts of reasons you already know. I don't need to rehash them. But how will this? Once you have the definition of what infrastructure is, you have to figure out how you're going to implement the plan. And this again is where we're sort of flying blind a little bit. And I say that because the stimulus of 2009 is largely looked at least from an infrastructure perspective, as a wasted opportunity. And I think the lawmakers understand that, and especially on the Republican side, nobody wants to do that type of stimulus plan again. So what I think is going to happen, and again, if I could bet on this, I would, but there is no guarantee that this is actually going to be the case. In the states that I mentioned earlier, that I showed you for the state revolving fund, and all the states across the country, I think are going to be asked for a list of projects that they need to be done, whether they're in design, whether they're being bid, or anywhere along the process. The states and the governors will have the opportunity to say, we have 5, 10, 15 maybe projects where they want federal government assistance. And once all of those lists from 50 states are compiled, they're essentially going to do what they do with WRDA and the Army Corps of Engineers process. And they're going to vet through these projects, and they're going to specify exactly which projects get funded, exactly what the scope of those projects are, and how they're going to fund those projects. That's going to be very different than, here's $100 million to do water treatment facilities across the country, and then just let the EPA administer it or something like that. My guess is, like I said, that the buy-in from the states is going to be much greater. So that leaves us again with an opportunity where we need to be in front of our state and local governors and lawmakers to say, hey, look, there's this project along, I-85 or 75 or Highway 1 or whatever, wherever the location is, that needs to do this, and it's going to cost us about this much money. And oh, by the way, while we're at it, we may as well add another $15 million to do the roads. We may add another $3 million to do the bridge around it, and then bundle that project and move it forward. To have those sorts of shovel-ready, in the sense, to use a term that was popular in 2009, project to move that forward. That's something that Congress admittedly hasn't done very well and hasn't really tried before, but it works by and large for the Army Corps of Engineers. Now, granted, the Army Corps of Engineers is still a government program, and they don't really have to account to anybody. But I think that's going to be the way that this infrastructure plan moves forward, rather than taking a bigger bite of the apple and saying, we're going to create an infrastructure bank, or we're going to repatriate dollars into a specific fund, a new fund, and administer the program that way. I think this administration is looking to get dollars into infrastructure projects as quickly as possible. And in my conversations with the new administration, that seems to be the direction that they're moving. Again, not a guarantee, but that seems to be the sort of rubber stamping that this advisory committee will be asked to do. And then we sort of talked about this a little bit, but how all of these projects will be financed will be of great concern. Will there be a matching system from the states? Will there be an infrastructure bank? Will there be a consistent funding process, as in there will be a line item in the tax code where every 30 cents on the dollar in overseas repatriated dollars are going to go straight to infrastructure? We don't know. Obviously, we would rather have a consistent funding stream rather than a sort of one-time infusion, which is more along the lines of a one-time tax holiday for a repatriation or for corporate tax reform. But a sustainable infrastructure financing mechanism is certainly the ultimate goal. Will we get there? Flip a coin. And then, and ultimately, once all of these three things come together, and that will lead to what the infrastructure plan is going to look like. And there is a lot of question as to whether or not Congress has the appetite for this. I think over the course of the spring, you're going to see some significant fights, as we mentioned earlier, about the Affordable Care Act, that just might take all of the emphasis on infrastructure away and completely lose sight of where the president wanted to be when he said we want to invest $100 billion in infrastructure. So that's sort of the lay, quite frankly, the lay of the land. And we can talk at length about what the infrastructure plan is going to do. I'm happy to talk about some of the plans that NUCA and WASDA have been putting forward to address these needs. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention one thing, and that is your involvement is going to matter in this, probably more than I think any of you really realize. Whether it's reaching out to your lawmakers to get a project that you know of on a list that goes to the Congress, or whether it means pressing your congressman to actually get off his ass and do something about it, is going to play a role in this that hasn't been seen before. Because if the election of Donald Trump taught us anything, it's that elections matter, and that talking to people within your sphere is not going to give you the full picture of what your constituents want. That the polling data before the election are the evidence that I cite for this. Every poll that I saw had Hillary winning by 12 to 15 points. She ended up losing. Well, she won the popular vote, but lost the Electoral College by what amounts to about 6 or 7 points. So every poll had it wrong, and they had it wrong because they were just talking to the people that they agreed with and who would answer the phone and who were willing to give their opinion. And the people that elected Donald Trump didn't want to give their opinion, didn't want to be talking about it, just wanted something different. And I think that, if anything, that has pulled out a sense in both parties that they need to be more responsive in listening to their constituents a little more. So I'll end on that. Again, happy to take your questions. Please consider joining us in Washington in May. We have what we call the Washington Summit. It is a fabulous opportunity to get down and dirty with the legislative process. I know several members like Bill came last year for the first time, Tom also, and I think that they would tell you that it was a valuable opportunity, not just for their industry and their work, but also for understanding how this process works and how the sausage gets made, because it's never pretty, but we all gotta eat.